Good day, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dillon, and it is my pleasure to present my action research proposal centered around improving reading fluency at the Success Anglican Primary School. At the Success Anglican Primary School, there is a student population of 494, all boys. There are also 22 teachers, including the principal, the vice principal, heads of department for infants, the junior level, as well as the senior school. There is also a system called the level coordinator system, in which one teacher from each level is primarily responsible for communication between the administration and the rest of the level. The school is pretty heavily involved with the Anglican Church, particularly through its affiliation and administration by the Anglican Education Board and Management. There's a problem or a challenge with consistent parental involvement at the school at the moment, particularly due to the fact that the PTA is non-functioning and has not been functioning for a number of years at this point. Of course, the recent challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic also exacerbated that issue with parental involvement. Now, the nature of the action research that was carried out necessitated the formation and the administration, or perhaps I should say the functioning of a PLC, a professional learning community. Now, due to the constraints caused by the pandemic in terms of schedules of individual teachers and members of staff, the PLC was relatively small, consisting of the school's principal, 2 teachers, including myself, as well as the school's guidance officer. However, its size, in my opinion, did not lead to any decrease in its effectiveness, as the discussions and the deliberations as well as the actions undertaken by the PLC were quite effective. The action research model that was employed throughout this action research proposal is the Ferrance model, which consists of the following steps, beginning with identifying the problem, gathering data associated with the problem, the interpretation of that data that was gathered, acting on the evidence that was presented by the data, evaluating the results of those actions, and then finally the consideration of next steps before repeating the model if necessary due to the cyclical nature of action research. The discussions of the PLC focus primarily on the issue of language, and language performance being a bit of a challenge due to the anecdotal evidence gathered by teachers. Now, of particular concern to the members of staff, the principal, as well as the entire PLC in a nutshell, was that reading fluency in particular was considered subpar. This view was taken due to the performance of the school in a Ministry of Education reading assessment. As part of our efforts to narrow our focus upon an actionable issue, the PLC met and engaged in a brainstorming exercise. The concept map that you see represents our efforts to ensure that each person's ideas were represented and that necessary connections were made in the attempt to determine what was the best method to improve the school's reading performance. Having identified a particular issue, the next step of the action research process was data gathering. Numerical data was taken from the Ministry of Education's reading assessment, particularly the oral reading fluency aspect of it. We also had semi-structured interviews performed with teachers as well as parents. We wanted to ascertain from teachers what were some of their problems with the instruction and the teaching of reading. We also wanted to know what might be some of the best ways to help parents to assist in their children's learning and their children's development of reading ability. Now, this is a sample of the oral reading fluency standards as mandated by that reading assessment sent by the Ministry of Education. We can see that we have 4 levels. At level 1, you have urgent intervention needed because of little reading or no reading, extremely slow pace in terms of the intonation, in terms of the prosody of the student. At level 2, you have some word by word reading, Moderately slow pace, however, intervention is also needed, also recommended. At level 3, we have more competent levels of reading with few breaks, pace sounding almost like conversation. And then at level 4, extremely competent readers, level appropriate rate of reading, consistently smooth pace, self-correction if needed on the part of the student. These are the things, therefore, that we looked at when we considered how many of our students were performing at each of the particular levels. Having performed data collection, data analysis revealed several insights based on the collected information. More than 40% of students throughout the school are reading at lower levels, that is levels 1 and 2, indicating that there is a quite urgent need for intervention, particularly in terms of oral reading fluency. The problem was even more exaggerated when examining the results from standards 3 and 4, the highest levels of students assessed during this exercise. More than 55% of those students were actually reading at either levels 1 and 2. The information that came in from the interviews with teachers, the concerns that were expressed, that is, one of the major issues that was expressed was lack of training and support in terms of instructional methods for the teaching of reading. The other major concern was the oversaturation of the timetable and the pressure to focus on exam preparation. That concern mostly came, however, from the higher levels, from standards 3, standards 4, standard 5. Those teachers thought that, reading instruction became a bit more difficult simply because of the pressure to focus on all other subject areas in preparation for the SE examination. When parents were interviewed, some of their concerns included uncertainty and the lack of familiarity with ways to support reading within the home, as well as a lack of time to properly engage students due to work schedules and the existence and the importance of their other duties. Now, having collected the data, having analyzed the data, our next step was to propose actions. The scope of this action research, of course, did not include the actual implementation of the actions. However, the PLC did meet, and these are some of the actions that we came up with. The areas of focus for those actions were: 1, to develop systematic methods to improve students' reading performance, and 2, to develop means of supporting both teachers as well as parents with the delivery of the necessary content. Those themes led to a theory of action. Of course, the theory of action includes the components, the steps that we are going to take, the action mechanisms, the ways in which we are going to ensure that those components are fulfilled, the intermediate outcomes, the things that we expect to happen even throughout the process, and the final outcomes, the things that are going to happen at the end of the intervention cycle. The first action, or the first component of the theory of action, was the development of repeated reading in small group sessions to be done within the school as part of a regular reading schedule by teachers in all classes. The action mechanism was to have that pronunciation, that prosody modeled by teachers, and to have students engage with the material and get instant feedback. The intermediate outcomes would have been, or will be, an increase in specific structured reading activities, with the final outcomes, of course, being the improved oral reading fluency. The second component of the theory of action was the development of reading PLCs throughout the school. It was hoped that this would allow for sharing of strategies and the sharing of relevant literature concerning the instruction and the teaching of reading, as well as providing that peer support base for teachers so that they can have improved comfort and improved ability to teach that reading, that necessary reading instruction. The intermediate outcomes, of course, would be improved instruction by teachers, with final outcomes being the improved reading fluency, and other reading outcomes for students, as well as having that increased buy-in from teachers. The final component of the theory of action was the provision of reading materials, resources in the form of recordings to parents, The action mechanism to have access to those recordings in order so that parents can accompany their children's reading practice within the home, particularly for those parents who may not be confident in their ability to support their children's reading. So it is hoped that the intermediate outcome would be increased opportunities for practice and engagement with that oral reading, and the final outcomes, greater parent and student involvement in the process and the teaching of reading. The following are the timelines associated with the actions presented within the theory of action. Implementing repeated reading in small groups within the classrooms is expected to take the majority of a term, or about 12 weeks, so that ample data and ample practice can be done both by teachers as well as students. The formation of the reading PLCs is expected to take about 3 weeks, so that teams can be developed, they can meet, they can receive support from administration in terms of getting started, and then providing the recorded materials is expected to take about 4 weeks to do the recordings, as well as to develop the platform through which parents are going to access those materials when they are ready. Of course, these actions are not necessarily going to be done concurrently, so that they are not going to be additive, but rather by the end of a term all of the various actions should be underway. Having proposed the different actions, the next step would be to propose the evaluation of the actions to determine their success or determine what comes next. To evaluate the repeated reading strategy, a quasi-experimental design can be implemented, in which we can have an experimental group to begin with of one standard 3 class as well as one standard 4 class. The control groups would be the other classes at standard 3 and 4 levels. At the end of the 12-week period, a test can be done and it can be analyzed to determine how successful the intervention was in improving reading fluency within the experimental group. It is expected that the experimental group will show greater progress than the control groups, specifically in terms of their oral reading fluency. At the end of the intervention period, surveys can be conducted both with teachers as well as parents. We can evaluate teachers' attitudes towards reading instruction at the end of the intervention, and we can also evaluate parents' attitudes and feelings towards reading activities in the home, and whether their comfort level has increased with supporting their children in the necessary activities. The next steps, assuming that the interventions have been successful, could possibly be the implementation of those interventions on a school-wide basis beyond the experimental groups. However, if the interventions prove not to be as successful as anticipated, then the next step would most likely be going back to the literature to attempt to develop additional strategies to improve reading fluency as needed. I thank you again for your time and your attention. It was my pleasure to bring this proposal to you. I do look forward to our continued interactions in future. Thank you again.